Hello, I'm Michael Hainsworth. The federal government unveiled this week its $581 billion budget. The Prime Minister calls a sea change. It slashes the public service, adds billions for national defense, infrastructure, and housing, while almost doubling how much it's borrowing. Over the next 5 years, more than $141 billion in new spending will include $51 billion for bridges, roads, and transit. $5 billion is earmarked over 3 years for new hospitals. $1.7 billion will go to new research chairs, laboratory gear, and other grants aimed at helping foreign academics move to Canada. Meantime, Ottawa will cut in half next year the number of new international student permits. Previously, it was almost 306,000. Now it will be 150,000. And more than 1 in 10 public service workers will get a pink slip or early retirement as part of the government plan to cut federal spending by about $58 billion over 5 years. It also means reducing the federal subsidy for medical cannabis for veterans and RCMP officers. This is Bill Robson, President and CEO of the C.D. Howe Institute.
Once again, we see a budget that, like its predecessors ever since the beginning of this decade, shows projections for spending that are higher across the board than what previous budgets did. And so what that tells you is not just that the government is spending more in the budget, which of course they advertise, it also shows you that the projections made in each successive year turn out to be unreliable.
Bill joins us now. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Does this budget get a passing grade?
No. Since you ask a simple question, I'll give a simple answer. It does not get a passing grade. Your description of the budget measures used words like will, things that are going to happen. But my fundamental problem with this budget is that it seems to continue a pattern that we have seen in federal budgets for several years now, where every time they roll out a new set of projections, they blow past their previous spending and borrowing targets to such a degree that you really have to look at each budget with a skeptical eye and say, how much of what's in here is really reliable? Some of the individual measures, including some of the ones that you mentioned, will come to pass, I'm sure. I was delighted to see, it's a small thing, but getting rid of the luxury tax on expensive boats and airplanes, which has long been known, for example, just to be a revenue loser, far more trouble to administer and far more damaging to the economy than any amount of revenue. But when you look at the big issues, the amounts of revenue they're counting on, the overall trajectory of spending, including the public service headcount that you mentioned, I'm very skeptical about this budget because for all the talk of restraint, we now see spending that is actually higher than was projected a year ago in every year of the projections. So when you start with that, you just have to ask yourself, like, where's the change here? I hope some of the things that they've announced by way of more support for investment and lower operating costs for the federal government will indeed come to pass. But it is a stretch to look at this budget and say these things are in the bag, because the past record suggests that nothing of the kind.
So your past experience has shown that they project one figure, we get a substantially different figure, and that there isn't any real serious accountability associated with that. So I can understand how you might be reluctant to be optimistic that some of these measures will in fact come to pass, or at least at the dollar values that we've been told to expect. But having said that, does this budget address the demise of our relationship with the United States, or does it just prepare us for the economic fallout, or at all?
Yeah, there are a couple of things that it does that are clearly motivated by the trade aggression of the United States. One of them is the extending the, they've given a new name, the productivity super deduction, but we're continuing to provide fast write-offs for various types of investment, particularly in the manufacturing area. Now, that's addressing a very particular competitiveness issue against the United States and a particular economic sector that's being depressed by the U.S. trade aggression. So there's a sense in which that's a pretty straightforward thing. When it comes to a lot of the other measures in the budget, though, I have to say that the immediacy of the challenge the United States presents us with and the time frame over which some of these budget measures are going to take effect, they just don't line up. I would have thought that the trade aggression of the United States would warrant something much larger and more far-reaching on the corporate tax side. For example, a general investment tax credit or lowering the corporate income tax rate. Those would be very attention grabbing. Those would be decisive signs that the government was changing its approach, as opposed to this targeted stuff where they reward, if you like to think of it that way, certain sectors. I mean, it's very much of a government picking winners kind of approach. When it comes to preparing for the overall softer economy, there are people who will say that letting the deficit blow out past $70 billion in the upcoming year is providing a little bit of support. And it may be that when you're sort of adding up GDP and adding up all the components of GDP and the dollars of spending, that you can find some impact of that higher government spending on consumption and government spending when they do the accounts. But that's not at all the same thing as addressing the concerns that are on people's minds. There's a bit of a cratering of confidence in Canada right now. And to see a budget that resembles in so many particulars the federal budgets that we have seen over the last 5 years, including, more agencies, more funding programs that we know are going to take a long time to ramp up and are going to dribble out their money according to all the things that, government usually dribbles out money according to all the regional considerations, all that. There's nothing fundamentally different there, and I don't think it rises to the occasion.
You mentioned the GDP expectations. The budget projects real GDP growth at 1.2% next year, and then recovering to an average of 2% per year for the rest of their outlook. Can we even accurately project growth in the age of random tweets and tariffs?
Well, it's very difficult to do. Every forecaster is now accompanying their forecast with comments about the wider range of uncertainty, and in many cases, we get multiple scenarios. So it's clearly a very difficult environment. When you're the federal government or the Bank of Canada, or a business for that matter, you have to have some kind of central tendency to your forecast. It's all very well to have scenarios in order to get people to think a bit about contingencies and loosen up our imaginations a little bit, as opposed to just that single point forecast. But you do have to, when you're making your fiscal plan, or if you're setting interest rates, if you're the Bank of Canada, you do have to have a number that is your central expectation. So the concern here would be that that is a little optimistic. And the reason such a low number can look optimistic is partly the reason that you mentioned already. But in addition to that, we've got the very negligible growth of the economy's productive capacity. And that's partly a matter of population. We had an explosion of population growth with a lot of immigration of relatively low skilled people, certainly people who weren't having as much success in the labor market as you would want, and having trouble finding housing and all the rest of it. But in addition, and very centrally to the preoccupation, and the budget talks a lot about this, our investment is so bad. So if your workforce is barely growing, and the amount of capital per worker isn't growing, then how does your productive capacity grow? And if your productive capacity isn't growing, even 2% GDP growth over the projection horizon looks like a bit of a stretch. So it's looking a little optimistic. The government does talk a little bit about the downside, but I go back to what I said earlier when it comes to the budget measures themselves. The extra spending the federal government is doing is just not going to be a sufficient push, especially when you think about the flip side of the going further into debt in order to finance this stuff. That has a bit of a confidence destroying effect. And what we really needed was to see more energetic stuff that would encourage investment and would enable the productivity growth that would let the slower growing workforce produce a higher GDP, which is so central to the fiscal plan.
Productivity is something that the CD Howe has been banging on about, for as long as you and I have been talking to each other. I know that, and that's at least 10, 15 years or so, Bill. This was described as an investment budget aimed at addressing productivity.
Well, that's the labeling, but when you look at the individual items in the budget, it really does not differ that much from what has been done in the past. There's a bit of a proposed accounting change where the government is trying to persuade us that everything that it says is related to capital formation should not count towards the deficit. Happily, they sort of put that on the stage, and then when they present the serious numbers. They haven't done anything with the accounting. I was afraid that they would. But the low level of investment is a symptom of low productivity growth in a sense, because businesses are clearly not feeling as much of a spur to invest as they might if the opportunities created by new technology, new know-how, new opportunities in markets were stronger. But the other problem with the low investment numbers, as I was mentioning already, is that as a sign of where we're going in the future, they're very disappointing. And the thing that makes me particularly anxious about this right now is the contrast with the United States. If I'm being polite to the government, you could justify their focused on faster write-offs of investment, particularly in manufacturing and processing, because the United States has been just handing us our hats when it comes to investment in that areas. The last quarter for which we have data, the second quarter of 2025, U.S. investment in machinery and equipment per worker was triple what it is in Canada. So that's a huge gap. Very speaks very poorly for our competitiveness, and it speaks very poorly to the increases that we're going to be seeing in our living standards. It's not clear to me that what the government has done here is going to do very much to turn that kind of a number around. So, when we're looking for things that they could be doing to improve productivity, I do like the mention of infrastructure. They even talked about privatizing airports, which I think would be a terrific thing to do. And it's true that the federal government can make a big difference if it's investing in the infrastructure that lets us get our goods to other export markets, particularly than the United States, for example. But again, I just look at this budget and I look at the budgets that we've been seeing, 2022, 2023, 2024, and I say, is this really as different as what they're claiming? All right, it's not as different as what they're claiming. And is the result going to be any different? Well, possibly it won't be any different.
I'm hoping that at least there's some silver lining to the cloud that's hanging over your thoughts here. Good news for the energy sector, removal of emissions caps and tax credits.
Well, they seem to be preparing the way, and the number of items. I mean, this is all speculation, naturally, but there are things that didn't appear in this budget that the government is certainly thinking about for further down the road. So yes, it's helpful that they're kind of preparing the ground on the emissions cap. Maybe we're going to see some changes to the electric vehicles mandate, but the timidity is palpable. If timidity can't be palpable, I mean, it's a nearly 500-page document, and you would think that if we were facing an economic emergency and the government had a very forceful plan with which to address it, that they would be able to give us a shorter, more cogent document. You talked a little bit in the lead in about some of the sort of community-oriented investments. Those things are kind of nice to haves, but we've had an awful lot of that over the last 5 years. The federal government has been spending very freely on that type of thing. And yet here we are with this productivity crisis, and the federal government having used a lot of its fiscal room to do things that manifestly did not spur investment, did not help our access to markets overseas, and so on. So again, I wish I could be more positive. Partly, I guess it's just a matter of expectations that were raised so high in advance of the budget and caused a lot of commentary. You saw a lot of people kind of repeating the lines about generational and transformational. And then when I'm looking through the budget, plowing through, the 400 plus pages of it, most of what I'm seeing, it's re-announcements. It's the same old messaging. There just is not that kind of, here in the first 20 pages are the key numbers and the major tax changes that we are doing that are going to get this economy going again. You just don't see that in this budget.
Yeah, I read your piece in the Hub that pointed out that you got to get to page 249 or so before you actually get into the meat of the document. I'm still looking for silver linings. Prime Minister did make good on his election promise by introducing the GST rebate for first-time home buyers. Now, critics are saying that this budget addresses the housing crisis by trying to reduce the demand side of the equation by cutting immigration. Is that fair?
Well, it certainly was part of the problem. I mean, we had a housing crisis that suddenly got a lot more intense, and straightforwardly, we had population growth that was suddenly at rates that we hadn't seen in generations. So the two factors are certainly connected. The number of people per dwelling, if you just look at a very top line number like that, was going in the wrong direction. So the demand side mattered a lot, and one of the criticisms that I and many colleagues at the CD Housing Institute have been making of the government's approach to housing for many years now is that a lot of it was demand side, making credit more freely available, providing tax breaks to the potential buyers of houses. Those things can induce a little bit of extra supply, but the way they do it is by raising the price of houses, and that causes a bit of a supply reaction. To actually do things that make it cheaper and easier to build, that's how you do something on the supply side. And the difficulty there is that the federal government is a long way away from the action. There is no way in the world that the federal government is going to realistically be able to improve the permitting process in a city such as Toronto. Many of the things that they can do are only very indirect, and it's a bit disturbing to me to see. The federal government is reacting to the polling that they do in this area when a lot of Canadians are asked what kind of nation building project appeals to them in this time of crisis. A lot of them say housing. So the federal government kind of goes to that. It's a pocketbook issue. It affects a lot of people. We all know, maybe in our own families, younger people who are having enormous difficulty finding a place to live. But as a response to Donald Trump's trade aggression, as a response to this almost existential crisis that we're facing of confidence and our competitiveness and our productivity and our ability to raise our living standards, supporting more residential housing it really is not the answer. We all want to live in nice houses, that's true, but we also want to have well-paying jobs, or else we're not going to be able to afford to live in those nice houses.
The Carney government has allocated $73 billion for national defense by the end of the decade. It's probably the most since the Korean War, and we're now at 1.5% of GDP, if I understand correctly. And on that basis, we're on track to meet our NATO commitments by 2035. Are you happy about that?
Well, we certainly should be spending more on defense. So I like the fact that the budget money is there, even though I wish that less of it were borrowed. And I like the fact that the government is leading. This is an important example of a situation where the government is actually leading the debate, because I think that kind of leadership can be very effective. And if we're looking for a silver lining in the budget, the fact that we're now getting this kind of forceful expression of concern about our productivity crisis and the need to do something about it, that's important. So the government is leading by way of the language that it's using. And so to me, the next question or the next kind of shoe to drop, if you like, is how are they going to do this? Because military procurement is notoriously hard to do. The face of warfare is changing very fast. There are lots of people who argue, for example, that some of the big platforms of the past, the tanks, the battleships, and so on, are simply not, the manned aircraft are not the way to go in the future. So there's that fundamental conundrum of what kind of equipment do you buy? What kind of war fighting capacity are you thinking of? But in addition to that, in Canada, as in most countries, we're not unique in this regard. Industrial policy considerations have always been front and center. So does the shipyard in Quebec get the work? Does the shipyard in BC get the work? Where are we going to buy the stuff that we can make ourselves, or even, develop the industrial capacity for the stuff that we can't make ourselves? And there's a fundamental tension there. Is defense policy about equipping your armed forces so that they can go out and fight if they need to? Or is it about creating jobs in politically sensitive constituencies? And far too much of the discussion, even as we've now started to adopt this much more kind of war footing approach, has been about the industrial benefits and the benefits of the federal government's purchasing power and the jobs that we are going to create domestically. And if you're concerned that the armed forces are under-equipped, they don't have the ammunition they need, the ships don't float, the submarines are unseaworthy, and we don't have anything that we can fly into the next decade, then the industrial policy focus is all wrong. What we ought to be doing is we ought to be buying stuff off the shelf that's interoperable with what our NATO allies are using, and particularly the United States. So all of the logic of that points in an entirely different direction. So we're never going to solve that conundrum. I mean, it's inherent in every country's defense policy, because when it comes to defense industrial capacity, the logic of arguing we have to be self-sufficient is so persuasive. But if we're going to be devoting so many of those extra percentage points of GDP defense spending to making sure that politically sensitive ridings are getting their fair share of the spoils, then the armed forces are going to wait an awfully long time for the new equipment that they need in order to be ready to fight some battles that we previously thought we didn't need to fight.
So what's the most important thing to know about this budget?
The most important thing to know about this budget is that it is not as dramatic a break from the past as the rhetoric around it would lead us to believe. And perhaps the single most important indicator I can think of in that respect is that once again, we see a budget that, like its predecessors ever since the beginning of this decade, shows projections for spending that are higher across the board than what previous budgets did. And so what that tells you is not just that the government is spending more in the budget, which of course they advertise, it also shows you that the projections made in each successive year turn out to be unreliable. So that's my concern about this budget. We do not have a credible fiscal plan.
Bill, thank you for your time and your insight.
Thank you.
Bill Robson is the president and CEO of the C.D. Howe Institute. For further insight into Budget 2025, visit cdhowe.org. I'm Michael Hainsworth. Thank you for joining us.